Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 8 about civil liberties. It's the very first lesson of Unit 8, where we'll be talking about what rights are. In this lesson, you'll learn about rights, you'll learn about government powers, and you'll learn about the difference between negative rights and positive rights. Let's begin with what may seem like a simple question. What is a right? Take a moment and think about that. As people use the term right in casual conversation, what do they mean by it? Let me use an example to illustrate this. Let's imagine that you parked your car, and where you parked it, you saw the sign here on the left-hand side of the screen. It says that there's no parking from 4 to 5 a.m., and then from 9 a.m. on, there's 2-hour parking. So you park at 6 a.m., you're in some place for an hour, you come out at 7 a.m., you think the whole time that you were parked legally, no problem. But then you come out and you find a police officer putting a ticket on the windshield of your car. You might go running up to that police officer, pointing at the sign, saying, "I have a right to park here." What I want you to understand is if those are the words that come out of your mouth, you are speaking incorrectly. You do not have a right to park there. Now you may say, wait a minute, the sign, it's legal for me to be there. Of course I have a right to be there. Using the word right in that sentence is what makes it incorrect. You may be correct that the police officer shouldn't be giving you the ticket, that you should be considered legal to be there at that time, but that doesn't mean that you have a right to be there. And that's the way that many people use the term, just casually speaking, and it's not the correct way to use it. To understand the correct way to use the word right, to have the correct understanding of what it means, let's consider the illustration on this slide. What you see before there, it looks like two coins laying there. It's actually two sides of the same coin. On one side, we have the right to bear arms. In other words, a right people say they have to have a gun. On the other side, we have the power to regulate guns. This is what a government may say they have as they try to pass laws about gun control, for example. The reason I'm presenting it on this slide as two sides of the same coin is that I want you to get the idea that right and power are essentially the same thing. There's one coin here, in this case dealing with the subject of guns. There is a single coin. Now, depending on how you're looking at that coin, you may call it a right, or you may call it a power, but it is the same thing. The only question really is, who has the coin? That's what decides whether or not we call it a right or a power. So who might have the coin? Well, one option is the coin might be possessed by individuals. In that case, we'd call it a right. In the situation of the coin having to do with guns, we would call it a right to bear arms. Individuals are deciding for themselves whether or not they will have a gun. On the other hand, maybe the government possesses the coin. In that case, we would call it a government power. And the government would be deciding whether or not they want to regulate and control guns, whether they want to even ban people having them. They're the ones that are deciding about guns rather than the individual people. So, if you have a right to something, that means that the government does not have power over that thing. And if the government has power over a thing, that means you do not have a right to that thing. A way to think about this, back to the analogy of the piggy banks from a couple slides ago, is that the coin can only be one place at a time. Either it's in the individual piggy bank and it's a right, or it's in the government piggy bank and it's a power. It cannot be both places. You cannot have a right and the government have a power at the same time. It's one or the other. Now, we're talking about just the one coin of guns in this case, but it's true for any other subject that we could bring up. Abortion, taxes, military service, whatever it is. It's also applicable to getting a parking ticket. So, if you run up to the officer in that example that I was using, and you point at the sign, and you're saying that I legally should be parking here, you can't say you have a right to park there, because the mere fact that you're pointing at the sign, a sign put up by the government, tells you who's really controlling whether you can park on that street at that time. It's the government. That's why there's a sign there. They're the ones that are deciding. So while you may be correct that you're legally there, the proper way to say that would be said to say, I have the legal privilege of parking here right now. It's not that I have a right. I'm not the one that gets to decide whether I'm able to park here or not. The government's deciding. They have the power, which means I don't have a right. Now, this way of discussing rights views them as a negative, and that's how they're traditionally understood in America. Now, when I say a negative, I don't mean something bad. By calling this idea of rights negative, what I mean is that negative rights are things that the government cannot take from you. In other words, we're saying what the government can't do. That's why it's called a negative conception of rights. We're talking about things that can't happen. That's why the use of the word negative. Let me give you an example of a negative right. Constitution begins by saying, the Bill of Rights begins, the First Amendment, by saying Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Notice what it says. It's not telling us what Congress can't do. It's not being positive in its view. Instead, it's being negative. It's telling us what Congress cannot do. It cannot make a law infringing on somebody's right to say what they want. So in this situation, the government lacks power while the individual holds the power. So we're going to call this an individual right, and we're going to say that the government has no power. It's a negative right because it's telling us what the government can't do. That is the traditional view of rights in the United States of America. They are negative rights. Negative rights preserve or increase freedom. They keep the government out of our lives and let us decide for ourselves what we're going to do in a particular area. But there's another way of looking at rights that differs from this traditional negative view. Now remember, please, I keep saying this over and over, but I really want you to remember this. When I say the negative view of rights, I don't mean that rights are bad. Don't mean negative in that sense. I mean the view that rights are things that the government is not allowed to mess with. In other words, the government lacks power in that area. That's what we mean by negative. Okay. So that's the traditional view of rights. There's another way to look at them. And that other way can be seen in this quote from a politician from Texas named Sheila Jackson-Lee. Now, perhaps she is just incorrectly using words in this passage, or perhaps she really means this. But either way, this is definitely not a traditional view of rights that she's expressing here. Look what she says. Although health care isn't listed in the Constitution as some sort of constitutional right, she says it should be a constitutional right. Now, when she uses that word right, as I've now taught you, what normally she would be saying is there's something the government can't do. So if you applied it to here, you would say, well, does that mean that the government can get involved in health care? No, she's actually meaning the opposite of that. And this view that she's having is what we call a positive right. Okay, well, what do we mean by a positive right? Positive rights are things that the government must give you. So what Sheila Jackson-Lee was saying when she talked about health care being a right, a constitutional right, she was meaning that the government should have to provide health care for people. Now, notice how this is different from the negative view of rights as they were traditionally understood in America. She's not saying that the government should be barred from doing something. Instead, she's saying that the government should be required to do something. That's why we call this a positive view of rights. Now, again, positive in this case doesn't necessarily mean that this is good. Negative and positive, as I'm using the terms in this lesson, are not about things being good or bad. They're about whether the government's taking action or not taking action. So positive rights require the government to take action. In this case, to provide health care for people. Positive rights, however, arguably decrease or even destroy freedom. Unlike negative rights, where the government just leaves you alone, you can go do what you want, and thus you're more free, positive rights actually arguably take freedom away from people. Well, how so? Here's a quote from another politician that helps explain this. This is from a Kentucky senator named Rand Paul. Rand Paul is an eye doctor by trade. That's what he was before he got into politics. So keep that in mind as we look at his quote here. He says that in regard to this idea of a right to health care, he thinks people should realize something. Now, he realizes this as a physician, the kind of person that actually might be involved in this. He said, if you believe in a right to health care, you believe that you can conscript me, like draft you, like into the army. He says, if you believe in a right to health care, you believe in slavery. Now, that may sound like an outlandish statement, but let's think this through for a moment, whether it actually makes sense. Let's imagine that there's a right to health care, that the government must provide health care for you. That's what the right would mean. It's not that the government has the option of providing health care for you. If it's a right, they must give it to you. But when you require the health care, let's say that nobody wants to give it to you. So anybody the government turns to try to offer them money, to hire them, to get them to go give you health care, they all refuse, for whatever reason. Well, the government is still obligated to some way, somehow give you health care. So what are they going to do? Rand Paul is saying the only option they have left at that point, since no one is refusing to help them out, is they're going to have to put a gun to some doctor's head and make the doctor get over there and take care of you with the gun pointed at him the whole time. Essentially, they have to enslave the doctor in order to provide you the health care. Now, even less extreme, even if they can find somebody to hire to provide you the health care, they have to get the money from somewhere to do it, which means they have to go over to someone and forcibly take the money from them through taxes. Either way, they are taking someone else's labor without them wanting to give up that labor in order to provide this thing for you that the government is obligated to give you. Now notice, under a negative view of rights, they never have to do that. They never have to go do anything to anybody else to make sure you have freedom of speech or whatever. The government just has to decline to act. But in the case of a positive right, the government has to go force somebody else to do something for you. And Rand Paul says that's a form of slavery when they do that. Now, have we ever seen anything to support this view that Rand Paul is expressing here, of positive rights leading to slavery? Historically, we actually have. An example is the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a main competitor with the United States back during the Cold War. Eventually it broke up, as you see in this animated map on this page, that in the years after the Cold War it fell apart. But at one time it was this giant country that was a communist nation. It claimed to be creating a government of equality for everyone. But creating equality for everyone required this country to grant positive rights to people, to essentially promise that no matter what, they would deliver certain goods and services to the population. Well, what sort of services? Well, here's some things from the Constitution of the Soviet Union. It said that in the Soviet Union you have a right to work, you have a right to leisure, you have a right to health protection, health care essentially, you have a right to housing, you have a right to education. Now when it uses these term rights here, it's not saying that the government has to get out of your way and allow you to go get work if you can find it, or go get education if you want it. No, that's not what it's saying. It's saying the government must provide these things for you. Let me give you a more detailed example of one of these things that the government must provide to show you what sorts of things the Soviet Union's Constitution said they would do. Here's the part of the Constitution that talks about a right to rest and leisure where it says that you can't be forced to work more than so many hours a week. You must be given holidays off. You must be given cultural and educational institutions you can go enjoy. Sports and physical fitness facilities and tourism and recreational. The government is obligated to provide those things for you so you can go have fun. Now, in providing those things for you, the government has to get the resources and the workers from somewhere. They have to force other people to provide those things for you. And once they start down that path of forcing other people to provide things for others, it's the road to totalitarianism, which is what happened to the Soviet Union. You end up with an all-powerful dictator who abused his people, who put them in camps where they were slave labor to run the mechanisms of the state. And it was a horrible situation that led to the deaths of millions. Well, it's concerns about that are the reason that we have the American conception of rights that we do. Fear of tyrannical government is why we view rights in America as negatives, as things the government is not allowed to do. Traditionally, we have never wanted to empower the government by saying that positive rights are something that it has to give us. Because once we do that, once we say the government has to, now, I'm not saying that the government can't still do things for us, but those things should remain optional. If we vote and say, hey, give us health care, then they give us health care. If tomorrow we vote and say, no, we don't want health care anymore, then they don't. That's different than having a right to health care, where they must give it to us no matter what, no matter how people vote. Everybody could vote against health care, but if it's a right that you have, the government still has to give it to you, which means if everyone's against it, but you still have a right to it, they're going to have to go enslave somebody to give it to you. It's our worry about that sort of thing is why America traditionally has viewed rights as negatives. All right, now let's review what you learned in this lesson. If something is a right, who controls it? Does God control it? Does the country control it? Does the state control it? Or does the individual control it? Well, if it's a right, the individual gets to decide whether they have the thing or not the government. The government's required to do something or not to do something. What is something that the government controls? Is that called a right? Is it called a power? Is it called a privilege? Or is it called a mandate? If the government controls the thing, we call it a power. So remember, this two sides of the coin. If the individual controls it, they're the one making the decision, we call it a right. If the government controls it, they're the ones making the decision, we call it a power. What is a negative right? Is it something that the government must give us? Is it something the government can't take from us? Is it something that harms individuals? Or is it something that protects people? A negative right is something that the government can't take from you. So what then is a positive right? Is it something the government must give you? Is it something the government can't take from you? Is it something that harms individuals? Or is it something that protects individuals? A positive right is something the government must give you if you want it. All right, that completes this lesson, the first lesson from Unit 8. The next lesson will be from Unit 8, Lesson 2, and it'll be about fundamental freedoms.